We are very pleased to have Dr. Julie Coiro with us here today to talk to us about online reading comprehension. Dr. Coiro is an assistant professor of reading in the School of Education at the University of Rhode Island, where she currently teaches undergraduate and graduate level courses in elementary and secondary education. Julie speaks with educators nationally and internationally to share ideas about reading comprehension strategy instruction, the new literacies of the internet, online reading comprehension, and effective practices for technology integration and professional development. She's also the chair of the Technology and Literacy Education Special Interest Group for the International Reading Association. For those of you who are IRA members, when you get your Reading Today or you go on to Reading Today online, there's always a column from the Technology and Literacy Education Group, and they're wonderful to read. She was also named an Early Career Award winner by the Literacy Research Association in 2011. She has a massive, extensive list of publications in a variety of venues, including an edited volume of the Handbook of New Literacies online, and she graciously makes those available on her website. So I know in your handouts she shared her website. Her publications are available and hyperlinked in there. So we are so excited to have Dr. Coiro share her expertise and experiences working with young people as they read online. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Julie Coiro.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Everybody in the back can hear me as well? Okay. I'm just going to get that set up, and I'm going to explain my outfit only because I have this very fashionable belt that is really, I'm not sure if it's a camera case belt or what, but it is holding on my microphone. So I'm hoping that it won't unclip or anything in the process. But that enables me to be able to move around a little bit so I don't have to just stand behind the podium. So everybody in the back can hear me. I tend to get a little louder, so let me know. You can't hear me. Okay, great. I do tend to get a little louder as I start talking and moving around, so let me know if I'm a little too loud with the microphone. Well, welcome, and thank you very much for inviting me to share some ideas with you. Just a quick minute to let you know where I come from. I started out as a special education teacher in middle school. I grew up in Connecticut, and then I moved around. My husband's in the Coast Guard, so we moved around, and I taught a year of preschool in New York City, and then I moved down to New Orleans and taught for 4 years in a 3rd to 5th grade classroom with a range of different kinds of learning disabilities, social emotional kinds of differences, and I got my master's there as a reading specialist because I really realized that in order to engage these kids, they really needed to know how to read. And so that was the route that I started to take. I'm very much a passionate person when it comes to literacy. I know some things about technology, but I'm much more a literacy specialist than a techno wizard. So then I moved out to California and taught in Northern California with some gifted and talented students. I worked in a store called Reading Rhythm and ROM, which was children's software, children's book, and children's music. And so that's where I really started to have an opportunity to hear from teachers in and outside of classrooms and realize that was back in 1993 when the internet just kind of came out, and realize some of the ideas and the complexities of trying to practice good teaching, good reading instruction, and then what the heck is this thing called the internet that's messing me all up, and how do I fit that in? So I've spent the last 10, I don't know, it's actually, I think it's almost 20 now years, kind of hanging out in teachers' classrooms, working with teachers, working with kids. For the last 10 or so years, I've been doing a lot of research. And so what you'll hear today are some ideas that I've gathered both through research and both through just kind of hanging out talking with teachers. And so what I'd like to share with you is some ideas about this concept of online reading comprehension. What does it mean when we move from print to online kinds of environments from a reading comprehension perspective, and what are the implications now that we've got the Common Core? Some of the things that I hope to talk about today and to engage you in thinking about is, what is this idea of online reading comprehension? And to introduce to you some of the challenges of this idea of online reading comprehension and linking it to the possibilities of how the Common Core opens doors for us to provide practice in those challenges. And so I don't want to turn it into a negative, wow, this is overwhelming, as much as this is an awareness of what's hard, from what I've seen from both teachers and student standpoints, but then at the same time, the excitement that the Common Core provides for giving us, hopefully, some space and some time to actually engage kids in practice with these things that are so hard. And those things that are so hard that we'll talk quite a bit about are asking questions. Which questions are most important to be able to ask of the internet? Being able to locate information, both with search engines and once you get onto a website, being able to evaluate information in a lot of different aspects in terms of accuracy, reliability, point of view, and then this idea of how do I actually put it all together in a way that makes sense. Now these ideas, actually there's one more that typically fits into our new literacies perspective of online reading, and that's the idea of communicating. We're going to kind of, because of the time limitations today, we're going to encompass synthesizing with the idea of actually putting down these ideas, and then we won't worry so much about the tools that we'll use to share them. Because today will be mostly about introducing some of the challenges, some of the solutions I will share, but there's also a website that's kind of a self-running online module. It wasn't necessarily designed for that, but it seems to have become that in terms of how do I start to address some of these things in ways that we might touch on today, but what could it actually look like in the classroom? The other thing that I wanted to say, can I just get a quick hand raising? How many K to 2 teachers do we have? Okay. How about 3 to 5? How about 6 to 8? And how about 9 to 12? Okay. Typically, most of the work that I've done is about 5th to 8th grade. And so what I'm going to share with you are most of that. I have a whole other talk, but I have some ideas in terms of how you might think about that from a K2 or K3 level, and then also moving into high school. And so I'm going to ask you to kind of take some of these ideas and then hopefully the rest of the day really be able to think about, well, what do these challenges mean for me as a 2nd grade teacher or let's say a 10th grade teacher? The first idea is this of new literacies perspective of online reading is that we have some evidence, both quantitative and qualitative and just experiential kind of evidence, to suggest that there's additional new skills to read effectively and comprehend the kinds of information that we encounter on the internet. Sometimes our students are more literate than we are in those kinds of things. Many times, though, we actually know all the things that we need to know about how to teach well and how to teach reading well. And so what we need to figure out is how to balance the things that we already know about good teaching while giving students an opportunity to bring in the literacies that they have out of school to help us try to weave together how to use technology. The important thing, if you walk away with nothing else today, is the idea that the internet to me is all about reading, writing, and communicating. And because of that, it deserves a place in the regular classroom, not the computer lab down the hall. It's not something that only the computer teacher or the library media specialist is required to teach. It's something that we need to figure out as good classroom teachers. How do we make space for this in our curriculum in a way that we still build high-level thinking skills and reading and writing skills, but give kids an opportunity to practice what they're going to need when they get out into the workforce. Just 2 quick slides to give you some of that evidence. This is actually some older data now, but it's still kind of compelling. And really what happened with this was we had about 120 7th graders, and we gave them 2 assessments. The first assessment was their typical state Connecticut standardized reading test, okay? And then the second assessment was an early version of what now is we've been creating for about 6 or 7 years, called ORCA, which is an online reading comprehension assessment. And it entails letting kids ask some questions, use search engines to locate information, walking them through prompts to critically evaluate, asking them to synthesize, and then in this case it was to organize and communicate their information via a blog. And so what we found is the scores along the bottom are their offline reading scores, and the scores along the side are their online reading scores. And if you notice, I guess I don't have my little, if you see the big green I'm sorry, the purple dot up in the upper left corner, that is a student who was one of the lowest performers on the offline standardized reading test, but one of the highest performers in online reading. Similarly, if you look at the green dot in the lower bottom, that is one of our highest performing offline readers who also did almost the lowest online. And so what we started to see, this study was really, is there a relationship between at least how we're assessing offline reading and online reading? If there were a significant relationship, we would expect to see a straight line. If you're low here, you're low here. If you're average here, you're average here. If you're high here, you're high here, right up. Does anybody see a straight line? And in fact, when the numbers play out, a correlation of 1.0 would be they're completely related. What we got was a correlation of 0.1, which was virtually no correlation. Now, we did this on purpose the way we designed our assessment to suggest that there are, yes, indeed, very new strategies. However, one of the things I did in my dissertation was to try and understand, okay, we didn't know it would happen that way, but the kinds of tasks that we designed, if you think along a continuum, we could design an online reading task, which is nothing more than looking at a website and reading a paragraph. Okay? That is likely to be very, very correlated with what you would do when you would read a picture, read a printed page. However, if you ask kids to generate their own questions, use a search engine, critically evaluate, use a blog, that's going to be way on the other end of the continuum. So what we did here, what I did for my dissertation, was design a more realistic recognition of what we do online that reflects more offline kinds of reading and what we do online that reflects online to see if we can actually start to understand numerically the difference, and is there a difference? And what we found here, without getting into a lot of craziness, is that 35% of what kids do when they conduct an online inquiry task is reflected in how they do on standardized tests of normal reading, traditional reading. However, typically standardized tests ignore prior knowledge. And so we actually found that there's another 7% that just depends on students' knowledge of a topic. And then what we found was after we take those two things out of the picture, we've got another 15 or so percent that's explained by this thing we're calling new. Something new and additional that standardized reading comprehension assessments don't take into account. And so we need to consider those things if we want students to be proficient online. So that's basically all those numbers are saying, is there's actually something else going on here. So before I tell you some of the things that we've seen, I'd like you to take just a minute or two arguing that there are probably some similar things, but for sake of time, think about your own experiences reading on the internet. How do they compare with reading printed materials? And share with a partner what is one thing that you think appears to be different. And what might you notice about either you or your students and what they struggle with as they start to go through this process of asking questions and then using the internet to locate, evaluate, synthesize, and communicate. So just take a second, think for a moment, turn and talk with a partner. What's one thing that might be different? And are you experiencing anything that's hard? It might in a little while. Actually, would you mind filling that up?
Well, they're doing that. I'm happy.
Thank you. about 30 seconds to finish up your thought. Okay, I'm going to bring you all back together. Maybe. So if I can have everyone's attention again. Uh-oh, that's what I was afraid of. All righty. So if we had more time, we would actually break out and have conversations. But raise your hand if you think that there's at least one thing that might be different as either we or students conduct online inquiry in terms of reading comprehension. Okay? Okay? Now there might be some people who are saying, I'm not buying it. And that's okay. One of the things that I encourage you to do today is that whole idea about critically evaluating what I'm saying. Does that sound like things that you've had experience with? And so have you noticed either things that you or your students struggle with? Raise your hand if you've noticed something that your students struggle with, okay? That sounds like something similar to some of these categories. So one of the things that I'd like to do, this is just an slightly older, from 2004. We have another chapter that has kind of more theoretically defined this a little more clearly. But basically, the way that we're looking at how does reading and learning change on the internet and this idea of new literacies is you start by asking an important question. And we're going to get into each of these a little more, but rarely do we give kids an opportunity to practice how to ask their own questions. We give them a question, we say, go find the answer. And so that's a really big, it's critical, but it's the least practiced. Once we ask a question, there's new ways of locating information that go beyond flipping through a book, flipping through a card catalog, wandering through a bookstore or a library. There's new reasons for critically evaluating information. It's not that we're saying that we never had to think about these things before. It's just typically we reserved them for better readers who already got through some of the lower level kinds of reading things. And now all of a sudden, some people don't even put who wrote the information on a page. Some people lie. Some people persuade you and try to trick you. Okay? It's not that that never happened before. It's just now it's much more prevalent, and all kids are using the internet to access information. So it's not a choice anymore. It's a requirement that we need to teach even our first graders, because if they're not doing it in your classroom, they're doing it at home. They're going on the internet, they're asking questions, they're finding information, and sometimes they're getting tricked. Sometimes they're just getting persuaded in one way or another, and sometimes they frankly can't even find it. There's new context for synthesizing information because all of a sudden now information comes in print, in video, in audio, in multimedia kinds of ways, and we have to figure out, how do I take notes from a video? Do I make more video to take notes? Do I put it into a podcast? And then how do I actually share that stuff with somebody? Do I need the same media? Can I represent it in multiple kinds of media? So these are the things that we're arguing are part of this idea of online reading comprehension. And the particulars that we've been seeing, we spent several years interviewing hundreds of kids and finding out what's hard for you. And this kind of validates what on the earlier slide was our theory. You know what? Asking questions is really hard. What do I want to know more about? I don't know. You never have asked me that before. And now all of a sudden I get to a blank Google screen and I have to ask a really important question. That's really hard for me. I ask something, I get to a search engine result. Where do I read first? I click on something, I get to a website page. Where do I read first? What about all these things that are shining and flashing all over the place? Do I click on those? Do I skim and scan? Do I just start clicking and hope for the best? In terms of evaluating, how do I know which link is most useful? How do I know it's true? What is the author's purpose? You ask me all these things. I'm talking as a student now. But when do you teach me? I don't know, is what they say. In terms of synthesizing and communicating, how do I come up with an original idea when everything I search for already has 7.2 million other hits about it? But yes, indeed, you want me to come up with something original. How does that work? And then how do I share it with others? And so over the several years, and if we had 6 or 7 hours or 6 or 7 days, this is usually what we talk about, there's several activities that we've tried and through a couple of federally funded grants that go along with each of those challenges. And so what I'd like to do today is create an awareness of some of those challenges and slightly link you to some of the solutions to just start to get you to thinking about things. At the same time, there's obviously this set of standards called the Common Core that is challenging us to think about how we address expectations that are pretty high level for cognitive kinds of ideas, whether we're reading literature or informational text, whether we're reading it in social studies and history class. There's another set of reading standards that have to do with science and technical subjects. And those key areas of recognizing key ideas and details, identifying craft and structure of an author, that's pretty new. Integrating knowledge and ideas, and making sure that we give students an opportunity to do this across a range of texts that are easy to more complex. At the same time, we have sets of speaking and listening skills and expectations that actually the comprehension and collaboration piece is where much of the inquiry process and the aspects of online reading comprehension can be found. They didn't necessarily design it that way, but those are the pieces that deal with working with a partner, generating questions, building on each other, listening to what people are saying, validating other perspectives, thinking about more than one way to say it, critically evaluating, conducting research to be able to do that, looking at print and digital media together. All that's embedded in that piece there. And then there's also the writing idea, again, recognizing the availability that the internet provides for a range of text types with lots of different formats, the ability to be able to produce and distribute both printed and digital text, and again, the research component is embedded into the writing strand of doing research to build information and present knowledge from multiple sources. So it's very much in there, that inquiry process. The tricky part is how do we actually start to notice some of those parallels in ways that help teach them. And then alongside, the Common Core has not been very explicit to talk about these affective kinds of ideas, these dispositions, these ideas about being able to solve complex problems, being able to work collaboratively, focusing on persistence and learning how to learn. Whether or not they're embedded explicitly into the Common Core, they are very much a key part of whether or not students will be able to accomplish those expectations. And for a while, there was something called the Next Generation Learning Challenges that was created to invite teachers to create tasks, if you will, that address some of these affective components as you're engaged in the more cognitive expectations. And so that seems to have gone a little bit in terms of the focus, but I'd like for us to be able to keep that in mind as we think about things, because students' interest, their motivation in these things, their ability to work as part of a team together, noticing and recognizing that they may or may not have strengths in everything, but as a team they can figure it out, becomes crucial to the idea of online reading comprehension. Before we get into the other specifics, I also wanted to just give you an idea of how I've been spending the last 5 years of my life, to give you a sense of how could a performance-based task that really was never designed as, quote, an assessment, but much more as a real-life inquiry-based task, could be used to get an idea of how students are being able to meet the criteria for online reading comprehension, and at the same time, understanding how those experiences are giving them opportunity to address Common Core standards. I think most of you should have a 2-page little handout that has a list of Common Core standards in a little grid or a chart. Okay? And across the top, you'll see ORCA, which stands for Online Reading Comprehension Assessment, and the components of locate, evaluate, synthesize, and communicate. Now, I will be honest, you don't see question there, because the trickiest part for assessment for us right now is if we let all kids ask all their own questions, it's really hard to come up with a standardized way of dealing with that. So for right now, we've left the questioning piece off. However, we've created tasks, if you will, that are embedded or integrated around a focused question that also requires the ability for students to locate, evaluate, synthesize, and communicate. So this is just an example of a scenario. The big question, how do energy drinks affect your heart? Okay? And we've created a performance-based assessment that takes place in a Facebook kind of an interface. It has chat features, it has notebooks, notepads. It toggles back and forth between websites and the assessment interface. And the task is the president of the school board sends an email to students indicating she's considering a ban on energy drinks sold in school. Students are asked, along with an avatar to kind of support them along the way, to conduct online research and email the school board with findings about how energy drinks affect teen heart health. And so in the process, they need to search for things and use search engines. We created something called Gloogle, which is a search engine within our interface that enables kids to demonstrate their ability or their lack of ability to navigate search results, to navigate within websites, to take notes about the most pertinent pieces of information in their own words rather than let me copy paste the whole thing and dump it into the notepad. Okay? By doing this, we are providing experiences and practice with, if you look down the kind of the left side, the gray bars indicate, this is at the 7th grade level that we've been developing these assessments, that we've touched on almost all of the standards in reading informational text. And so the little number that you see in front each lines up with locate, evaluate, synthesize, or communicate. We've touched on almost all of the standards addressed in literacy and science. And we've touched on almost all of the writing standards. So the idea is if we can create more opportunities for students to practice in these scenarios where they're having chances to read and write and use the internet, they're practicing both the ideas and the skills that they'll need to be able to be better at online reading comprehension, and you're helping to prepare them for very similar kinds of tasks that they'll get on the Common Core. Now, I'm not suggesting at this point that they will have assessments of online reading comprehension, but we know that some of the things that students are able to do, especially in the area of critical evaluation, can carry over and kind of back, if you will, to their own critical evaluation of ideas offline. And so that kind of just gives you a framework for starting to think how these scenario-based tasks can touch on a lot of the strategies. So what I'd like to do now, is there any questions at this point? Big concerns, or I know it's a big group. Yes? So do you mean the reliability of the assessments that we've been using, or just the comparison between offline and online? So I can answer that a couple of different ways. This 5-year assessment grant that we've been working on, I'm not really an assessment person. That was not my intent. But what we've been doing is the whole purpose is to develop both valid and reliable assessment items. And so from the perspective of the tasks that we've ultimately come up with, they are reliable in terms of even human scores for about 86 to 80%, okay, 0.88 to 0.86 to 0.88. Now the other question, now tell me what you mean about the reliability between offline and online, and I'll see if I can answer your question.
Well, I guess if we're spending time testing our students online, and that's a measure of reading comprehension,
Yep.
is it
So do you mean, will what they learn online actually transfer back to offline? Or is it? It is very valid. So reliability from score to score, it is very reliable. Now, the validity of the tasks themselves, the scenarios represent precisely the kinds of things that high school students and people in the workforce need to be able to do to use the internet. And we have psychometric measures, if you will, that are looking at validity that's explaining about 80% of what they do. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, and tell me if it doesn't. So tell me what your question is again.
My question is, can I believe my math score? I guess that's my basic question.
It's different.
Score from
Using the computer and then reading and responding that way, you're saying that is not valid.
Okay, they're measuring different things. And so I think, and I don't know your particular state assessment, but I do know from our particular state assessment, they were designed to measure whatever the four areas were for NAEP at that point. It was more about, oh, I should know this. It was the 4 areas of comprehension. So one of our arguments was, we're basing all of our students' understanding of comprehension on those offline, very valid measures of those kinds of skills. What we're arguing is there are additional reading skills that students need to be able to accomplish that those assessments aren't even considering. Forget about whether they're representing them validly. So I think what I'm suggesting is that we need to start to consider both an offline assessment and an online assessment to be able to validly represent all of the reading strategies that students will need as they get out into the workforce. So I think they're measuring 2 different things. So I'm not suggesting the lack of correlation doesn't suggest that your assessment isn't valid. What it suggests is that they're measuring different things. And so what we're saying is those differences are not computer skills. Those differences are reading skills and writing skills that we need to consider as reading and writing teachers. Does that help?
Yeah, so if I look back at your study, and your study really says a student that's good with paper text may not be good online.
Yep.
A student that's good online may not be good with
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
Yes. Yep.
The difference is the math test is an online test testing reading comprehension, but your test
Ah.
is testing the use of the internet.
Yes, and that's a really, really important distinction that we've tried to make with ETS and PEARLS, and we finally, I'm kind of going off my topic here, but I think it's relevant if people are interested. Finally, PEARLS has actually listened because about 2 days ago, they've actually taken our ORCA assessments and turned them into the PEARLS assessment that will now go to 68 different countries around the world, and it measures online reading. And it looks almost exactly like our ORCA assessment. And so what's happening is we need a way to differentiate between a standardized multiple choice test of paragraph comprehension that we put onto the computer and we say, read the paragraph and select the answers, compared to an assessment that actually asks kids to conduct all of the components of online inquiry. And before, many people were saying, there's nothing different. We don't have to assess that because we know if you're a good reader, you're a good reader, you're a good reader. And what we try to say is, hold on. We see lots of kids, especially, doesn't happen as much anymore, higher performing girls from well-educated families who have been protected from using the big, bad, scary internet. And they don't do well in an online inquiry kind of fashion because they say things like, why would they do that when they get tricked? They literally can't comprehend because they've kind of been kept in a safe space. And so what we're arguing is we need to consider both of these ideas, and we haven't come so far to suggest, although we're headed there, if we engage kids in online inquiry tasks, can we actually build skills that transfer back to an offline measure? Does that help clarify things for people? Okay. Okay. So let's move on a little bit. It's tricky, it's hard, it's a little scary, but the idea is to help people understand there's something new going on. It is reading. We need to figure out how to measure it so we know how to teach it in a way that makes progress over time. I'll take one more question. Yep?
You mentioned that the assessments are broad, right, and hit all the literacy standards, et cetera. Are the assessments showing the overlap between all of those skills, reading, listening, writing, or is that teased out, or do you not want to answer?
It's really, really complicated. From an assessment perspective, we are very much not seeing that you can say locates here and evaluates here. And it is completely messy because we don't locate and then evaluate. We locate, evaluate, and then we change and we locate, synthesize, and then we might communicate because we have to send an email and ask somebody. And so it's much more complicated and statistically very, very interconnected. And so we're kind of simplifying it to say that it's question, locate, evaluate, synthesize, communicate. But from a teaching perspective, it's almost what we need in the beginning, and that's really what I'm going to help you try to do is understand it's complex and simplify it enough so we can even get a handle on what are the isolated pieces, and then how do we start to combine a task that says, you know what, today I want you to locate and communicate. That's it. And then, now that you can locate and communicate, now I'm going to send you to some place that's a little tricky. And I want you to locate and evaluate and communicate. And now, but I just want you to evaluate, is this even relevant to your task? And then, as you start to figure out what's relevant and not, typically what happens is I'm going to create a scenario that sends you in a direction where the two sites you're going to find are in direct contrast to each other. And then the kids are like, whoa. One's got to be real and one's got to be bogus. No, there's actually more than one way to see the world. And that's what happens with multiple perspectives. And when you get into middle school and politics and religion and all the stuff that's out on the internet now, that's what we need to start to help kids to understand. So all of a sudden, kids are faced with this complexity and they're like, what do we do? And then you're ready with the just-in-time instruction. Wow, let's actually look at who wrote this stuff. Now, so it's not like I start a day and I say, today we're going to learn about critically evaluating authors. Because I can tell you we did that in the beginning and we failed. Because we gave everybody laptops. You're talking teenagers with laptops, you got about 2 minutes. They don't care. However, if you give them a task and purposely set it up so they're going to find bogus information and buy into it and stand up and present it with the locate and communicate, and then you give somebody else who has a different task, all of a sudden, from an adolescent perspective, they look really silly in front of their peers. And then they turn to you and say, what do we do? I got my critical evaluation of authors in my pocket lesson, and now they're ready to learn it. So that's the kind of instruction that we're trying to deal with. So it is definitely not as simple as I'm going to make it seem today, but the hope for today is just to bring out an awareness of all of the places that even skilled offline readers could come up with a problem. And every single time they come up with a problem, in essence, one of the things we can do is have a just-in-time kind of lesson. It's a quick 5-6 mini lesson that's embedded in a task, that's inquiry-based. It relates to your curriculum. So I'm not saying that we need to move you out of your science or your math or your history content. Stay in it. Keep kids learning. But when they get to one of those trouble points, you've got an answer to help them. Does that make sense? I'm way off the slide. So we're going to go there, but that's I think I could probably move through a lot of this. So again, now what I'm going to do is give you some of those trouble points that we're seeing students face, whether they're 6 or they're 16 or they're 56. The first one is developing questions. What questions are worth asking? We believe that from a new literacies perspective, the kinds of questions that you ask of the internet and the kinds of questions you decide, you know what, I don't need the internet. I could just turn to ask my partner that question. Okay? We don't use the internet to ask a comprehension question about a book. Which character did this? But kids will try. They have a laptop in front of them. They think the internet's going to tell me. No, just look in the book. It says right here. But there's other questions that you can find on the internet. And then there's way better questions that don't have an answer. And that's the thing that kids struggle with. You mean you want me to use the internet to try and find an answer to a question that nobody knows the answer to? Yes. We don't want you to type in a question and have you give you the answer. That's stupid. Okay? That's an important thing to be able to do, but we want you, our new future, to be able to think about really powerful questions that are multidisciplinary, that are global, that are going to help save the world someday, and use the power of people and information and networking to start to move towards some collaborative answer. That's what the internet is about. And as you get engaged in that process, whoa, I got to figure out which search terms to use. I got to figure out who these people are that are saying these things. I got to figure out to send my message, my solution. And that's where these trouble points come in. But definitely the questioning is the hardest. So one of the things we found, and now I'm talking kindergarten, we all know kindergartners have billions of questions about everything under the sun. Okay? And what we end up doing, because we just don't have enough time, is those are really great questions, but we got to keep moving on. And so by second grade, third grade, I got a really good question, but there's no space for it here. By the time they're in middle school, because we've interviewed kids, and they say, my teachers don't care about my questions. By the time they get to high school, I don't even know what questions I have. I can't even begin to think about it because I've never had the space. Nobody has ever asked what I think, what am I interested in? And so the crux of the problem is the questioning, and quite honestly, it's the thing we know the least about, except to say the more we can model the complexities of asking questions. We as teachers take whole courses on how to ask good questions. High level versus low level, literal versus evaluative, thick questions versus thin questions. How do we start to model and give students an opportunity to develop those same kinds of questions? So here's two quick examples. With the primary grades, notice there's no computer in sight. It is not about technology. It's about interest and confidence and space to say, what are you interested in? And it doesn't mean chaos and we have to study a million different things. Here's a worm unit in grade 1. The teacher's comprehension assessment question, okay? At the end of this unit, my first graders will know, what do worms eat? Great, okay? What do your students want to know about that topic? Well, why do worms have a ring around their body? Why are worms afraid of the sun? What do worms sound like? Okay? They ask those questions by being embedded into interesting, motivating tasks that they don't know the answers to. And guess what the best part is? The teacher may not know the answer either. Because it's silly for me to go on a wild goose chase, look on the internet for the answer to something that I could just turn to my teacher and she could tell me. That's not the power of the internet anymore. Okay? So we want to create opportunities for kids to generate questions and then hear those questions by saying, those are really great questions. We're going to make those part of our unit. That might mean that not every student's going to have the same product. Okay? It might mean that, let's just say the teacher has 4 questions that she needs to have answered. Maybe there's 4 more. And you take groups of kids. You answer question number 5. You answer question number 6. Who wants to do question number 7? And then you come back. The beauty of the internet and sharing, who wants to watch a video of 30 kids saying the same thing all over again? Okay? You want to watch new, creative, innovative stuff. The only way that's going to happen if they have new, interesting questions that nobody's ever asked before. Because if we're going to start sharing millions of creations, it's going to look like that big bulletin board that sometimes we see in kindergarten where draw the snowman, but everybody has to make it look like this. And so you got 30 pictures of snowmen, and the kids are like, well, why did you draw it that way? Well, because my teacher made me. What would you like to do? Oh. So if we can create that space with kindergartners, 3rd graders, 5th graders, by the time they get to middle school, then we've got the space they've got the confidence to develop questions, and then we can start to build on that. So it's not that this can't happen also in elementary school, although the experiences that I've had, it's a little more with 5th to about 11th grade, okay? This is something called the BDA, before, during, and after questioning chart. Now, what happens is you create a little table like this, and the goal for your reading is to read, to ask questions. And the first thing that they can say, you mean I don't have to answer anything? Nope. Anybody know why that is? Because no kid wants to ask a really hard question, because then they have to answer it. And if they can't answer it, they flunk. And so there's no even smart reader, but certainly a struggling adolescent. Why would I want to ask a really big, interesting question? Because I'm never going to get the answer. But you need to start to communicate. We have scientists that go their whole life and then they die, and they never answer their question. But then somebody else does. But it wouldn't have happened if they didn't ask. So the goal of this, the explicit goal, is you give them something that's related to your content, that's interesting and challenging and going to foster some questions. And you say, so for example, this was, I think, a 8th grade class who was learning about tobacco addiction in part of their health class. So they would read, their goal was to read this article, but before you read, what questions do you have? Write them down, okay? Then they start to read. As you read, you don't have to answer your questions, but they often do. You have to ask more questions, because then what happens is you can't really ask a good question unless you've comprehended what you've read, because it prompts more wondering. So the best way to phrase this to kids isn't just questions, it's what does that make you wonder about? Because then they're a little freer. And when they know that they don't have to find the answer, it's okay, because the next problem is they might ask a question that if they had another source they could answer, but it's not in this one. And so I've literally seen kids try this in the beginning. These are 7th graders, just came from a classroom. We were then transitioning onto a website. What questions do you have? This was about the Lascaux Caves in France, okay? Wrote great questions. They got into the text. Their task was to develop during reading questions. What did they start to do? They started to realize that the questions they asked didn't have answers in the text that they read, so they erased their questions and designed questions that matched the answers that they got in their task. And I'm like, wait, you don't have to answer, you don't have to erase them, just add to them. No, there's no answers. So we actually ended up modifying this a little bit to say, what are your questions? This made kids really nervous that they didn't have a place to write down their answers because they're so used to being held accountable. So we made here's your questions, here's new questions that you have, and here's the answers to the questions that you already asked. So they needed that note-taking space, but they also needed the permission to ask questions that didn't have an answer. And so again, now that you've finished reading, what questions do you have now? Which really prompts them to want to go find some more sources. And the only time that we kind of held them accountable for answering, what do you understand now that you didn't understand before about this topic? Okay? And it didn't have to be a huge essay. It was 1 or 2 sentences, which really focused on their ability to kind of self-monitor. What did I know before? What did I learn from this? And what do I want to know next? And it's that what do I want to know next? What do I wonder? That's going to start the rest of the online inquiry process. Because if your kids don't wonder, they're not going to care about what they're inquiring about online. So questions is key. And 2 ways to do it. In the beginning, give them space to ask questions. It's not about the technology, it's about what interests them. What are things that you can ask that if you knew the solution, you could actually make a difference in your classroom, in your school, in your community, in your world? And truly, because of the internet and connections now, they can ask questions and find solutions that will change the world. Whether it's learning more about the child that was shot because he wanted to go to public school in a certain country and he was killed, they did research about it, they ended up networking with students around the world and creating a fund, and they built enough money, raised enough money to build a new school. So those are the kinds of things that can happen. And the other idea is giving them a very focused way before, during, and after to generate some questions, and along the way, think about things that they've learned. I think I probably talked about some of the values of those ideas about questioning, but it's that making space for natural curiosity that's going to continue everything else. Okay, so now the challenge is I ask these great questions, I plug them into the internet, and I get 7.2 million hits. Okay, how many of these things do I actually need? What's relevant to my needs? Is there a way that I can efficiently read search engine results without clicking on everything? Because we all know, especially as teachers, and one of the exercises I usually do with teachers is, I say pretend, but it's usually not pretend, okay? You've got the last 5 minutes of your lunch period, all right, that you want to do something interesting with your kids in the afternoon, you want to find something really quick. You got about 5 minutes, okay? What are you going to do? You do not have time to ask your broad research questions in the Google and to click and view everything. You want to search and scan efficiently. So how do we actually teach kids to do that? Okay, this is an activity that typically from our research we found, here's what happens. Kids type in a question, the whole question. They click on whatever comes up first. They go to the website. If the answer to their question isn't right there in a complete sentence flashing for them, they click the back button and they reframe their question and they're done. And they just keep doing that. And then you wonder how 40 minutes later they don't have anything of actual relevance. Okay? So the idea here is to engage kids in actually reading search engine results. And this is one of the arguments to suggest that search engine results are a reading comprehension activity. So let's pretend, as we were in this class, that we were looking for resources about ancient Egypt that were appropriate for 6th grade. Okay? So we came up with this list of search results. I took a screenshot of it before I taught this class with my students. And what you see on the back of your handout is the one kind of activity we'll have enough time to be able to do here. But again, each of the challenges that I introduced you to, we have paired some different activities. Okay. What we do as teachers is we take a screenshot of the search results, okay? And we put it on a piece of paper. And we print out the piece of paper so that students can't click anywhere. In the beginning, it's a really big punishment, okay? But it's reading and writing and thinking, and I can guarantee that it transfers back if you practice it a few times. Don't do this every day because your students won't like you very much. But what happens here, you print out the screenshot, and you ask comprehension questions that are literal, inferential, evaluative. But in order to answer them, they require those online reading skills. So I'm not going to necessarily tell you much at this point, except I'm going to walk you through a little bit. But the other component of what we've done when we teach things about the internet is as much as possible, because from a new literacies perspective, we truly believe that students know things that we don't about some technologies and about some ideas. So we create this scenario, and in this case, we have the questions. You work in partners, and we ask you to answer the question, ask you how you know the answer to the question, and ask you why it's important. Now, in teacher language, these 3 categories goes with the 3 levels of strategic knowledge. Declarative knowledge, what's the answer? Procedural knowledge, how do I find the answer? Conditional knowledge, when is that process important and when does that not work? Okay? They don't necessarily even need to know that, but I'm going to just give you a taste of it by practicing at least these 3 questions, okay? I'm going to tell you this is easy, this first answer, but there's a method to my madness. So there's 6 numbers there, and the first question is, which site features information about hieroglyphics? Which site? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6? If you think you know the answer, write it down somewhere in that little block. So what do you think the answer is? Just shout it out. Number 1. Okay? Now, of course, teachers would then say, great answer, and they would move to number 2. But I can guarantee you that there's lots of kids saying, how did she know that? How did she know that? So the follow-up question should be, how do you know that number 1 is the right site, the relevant site? How do you know that that site features information about hieroglyphics? And what's your answer? Okay, now, typically at this point I get, because it says so. It says so where? Okay, now some people call it a blurb, a blip, an anecdote, a whatever description. So all of a sudden, language becomes an issue. What are we going to call that? If we're going to talk about this strategically, we call it whatever you want in your classroom. It'd be useful if you called it the same thing as other teachers did, okay? But let's just call it a description, okay? Guess what the kids say now? You mean I got to read that stuff? I thought I just looked at the blue hyperlink at the top. So all of a sudden, by asking kids to engage, I found out a misconception. I had no idea. Now, I did, but if you didn't as a teacher, you hear, oh, reminder, I got to do a little mini lesson about that, okay? So how do you know? Now, how else do you know when you look in the description? What is it that you know? What is it that you see? Okay? You see ancient Egypt and you see hieroglyphics, and then kids say, well, how come hieroglyphics isn't bolded if that's what I'm looking for? How come hieroglyphics isn't bolded? Because it's not part of your search. And so all of a sudden they realize, whoa, I asked the computer one thing up here, and it's giving me programmed features for that one thing, but if I change my purpose, the features may not match anymore. And it's, again, it's a small little thing that maybe some kids know, most kids don't, and strategically it becomes a place for you to realize, my kids knew that, or whoa, there's another thing my kids don't know. Okay? And it goes on like this, and you just keep practicing. Now, the bonus is, because it's kids that are telling these answers and not me, especially middle school and high school, the kids listen because it comes from their peers. Okay? So I might then ask you, why is it important to know which of those 6 sites are best? How's that? Uh-oh. How does that help you? It saves time, efficiency. And so that becomes a quick point of conversation. You mean reading online is partially about efficiency, at least at this point? Yeah, reading with search engine results becomes a thing of efficiency. Later on, when you get to critically evaluating sources, now you got to slow down. But here, you have to skim and scan. And so this is a way of realizing, we might have to move this, but change it, but I'll try it one more time. I think it's just becoming looser. Maybe I'm too fat. A way of realizing that efficiency matters at this stage in the online reading process. Okay, so let's give you a chance to practice with these other 2. I know there's other questions, but I'm going to ask you which site is sponsored by a California school, and what's the biggest disadvantage to visiting only these 6 websites? Talk with a partner or 2, see what you can learn, and see if you can fill in the declarative answer, the procedural, and the how you know. Okay. Well, okay. 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 Okay, good. So yeah. I'll give you about 1 more minute. I know it might not be enough time, but we'll kind of do it together too. Okay. I'm going to pull you back together, and the question is, which website is sponsored by a California school district? What do you think the answer is? Number 4. Does everybody agree with that? Okay, so now we move on to, how do you know? Okay, the web address. And guess what you think? Guess what kids say? You mean I got to read that too? I don't even understand what that means. Perfect place for the quick 5-minute, here's what a website address looks like. Guarantee you, if you stand up and teach a lesson about URLs and domain names, the kids will not listen. They will not transfer from one day to the next, because we tried it. Did research on it. Just don't go there. Okay? Instead, wait for, you mean I got to read that too? How do I do it? They asked a question. You got the answer. Okay? Yes, you do have to read those. And by the way, those things have names. Sometimes they're called website address. Sometimes they're called URL. Why is that important? Because when we ask kids on the assessment, what's the URL of that website? I don't know. I'll know what the URL means. They do know the address, but they don't know that it's called a URL. So all of a sudden, we have to teach vocabulary, whether they're 5 or 15, that they're going to find on the assessment or in real life that they need to know. So for those of you who teach high school, we got to catch up and teach a lot all at once. If you teach kindergarten, 2nd grade, yeah, you got a little time. But that's certainly the same way when you introduce a book. This is called the table of contents. This is called the index. This is where you find the author's name. This is called a website address. It's also called a URL. It stands for Uniform Resource Locator. You know, if you don't know that, put it back out to your kids. Who knows what a URL is? Probably somebody will. And often, because we've done research on this too, the kid that says the answer is not going to be the same kid that typically does well in your class. It's going to be the computer nerd guy who spends time at home reading and writing in gaming environments. And now all of a sudden, you've now validated that student as a reader and writer in your classroom, and they know something that a smart kid doesn't know. That is huge. That's that piece about validating what kids know and taking a risk and saying, you know what, I don't know as a teacher what the answer is. Let's look it up together, or who knows? And if you don't have time, put it out there. Tomorrow, let's see if somebody can come back and tell me what a URL is. Somebody's going to go find it. Okay? Why is it important? Oh, wait. We didn't even finish. What about the URL or the website address tells you that it's sponsored by a California school district? Okay, so some people are saying K-12. What else? CA. Okay, so now, how do you know that CA is California and not Canada? Because it says US. You mean that there's context clues after the CA that help you with the meaning? How do you know that California is a school district? Because it's got the K-12 at the beginning. You mean that there's context clues before and after that help you understand the word? Yeah, except you have to have prior knowledge about what K-12 domains mean, what you have to know about countries and states and all those things. And so all of a sudden, prior knowledge, those numbers that I showed you at the beginning, begin to play a role in a way that they don't play on standardized tests. Standardized tests of offline reading comprehension are designed to get rid of prior knowledge as much as they can, because they don't want to advantage people who have more background knowledge. But it's real life. You're advantaged if you know what K-12 means, and you are disadvantaged if you don't. So we need to start through these kinds of conversations to find out, what do my kids know, what do my kids not know, and how are we going to start to embed a minute or two little mini lesson over the course of the year that by the end, they're going to walk away with a whole bunch of skills. And if you do that in elementary school, by the time they get to middle school and high school, we can actually do something of substance with that conversation. But right now at high school, we're going to have to double work and do some of those things too. Why is it important to know to look at the URL before you click on something? How can that help you? Okay, so they're not, so you get to consider, are these sites trustworthy? So you mean I can critically evaluate information without even clicking on sources? Sometimes you can. It's that beginning anticipatory kind of thing. Those are all little mini strategies I guarantee you kids don't think about, most kids. Okay? And it doesn't take too long of forcing you to do this on paper to see that transfer. And if it helps, bring this piece of paper and put it next to the search when you now have given them permission to move back online. Now remember, and it depends on your style and your kids, but for the emotionally disturbed kids that I usually work with, I say, so remember, if you don't practice these things, I'm going to take you away from here and you get to work on this on paper again. And it's more of the, I don't want to do that. So good. Make sure that you transfer this stuff onto the... Okay, the last question, and this gets us into the next thing. What's the biggest disadvantage to visiting only these 6 websites for information about ancient Egypt for 6th graders? And there's a hint, what's missing? Anybody want to take a guess? Yep.
I can't remember the names of them now, but like any of them of the major history sites that I use for social studies, that the government sites.
Okay, so you're right. So all of a sudden now we get to learn new. So I'm creating a space for you to take a risk. You've said, I can't remember, which is fine. So we now develop as a classroom some words for these. Okay, maybe they're government websites. Well, how do we know what a government website is? Well, it had a GOV at the end that you can actually look at. So what happens is by asking these questions, you just start to generate. But so you're right. So we need government websites. Anybody want to help out? Is it government websites that are missing? Yep.
It's really limited with 6th grade knowledge, so it doesn't really open up a window for higher level.
Okay, good. So how could we unlimit it? How could we open it up? Change the search terms. So all of a sudden we're learning how to refine or more generalize. And so again, even now we're talking about evaluating, we're talking about locating, we're moving back and forth. And so that gets into conversations of, it actually has implications when you put 6th grade. I know you're a 6th grader and you want 6th grade stuff, but how many 6th graders do you know that are experts about ancient Egypt in a way that, so what is it that's missing here? Okay, so can we put a label on these websites? Educational, could be. Certainly reliable. Okay, one student, I got to skim through this real quick. One student, and this is what I learned from a class, told me, well, the biggest thing that's missing is there's nothing from an Egyptologist on there. And I thought, what's an Egyptologist? Well, that's the expert on Egypt. Oh, and so we had a little conversation about that. Okay, but the idea here is that's important. There's no primary sources. Okay, we're all teachers, and there's nothing to say we don't know our stuff, but maybe we're not ancient Egypt experts either. And so it could be that we found information from a less than reliable website as a classroom teacher, trusting it, put it on our website. We know that teachers replicate other people's websites, so all of a sudden, kids say, well, there's 7 teachers who said the same thing, it must be true. Well, again, not discrediting any teachers, but, well, let's go to a primary source. And what is a primary source, and how is that different than this? All of these things create opportunities for you to teach content. And the tricky part is, in the beginning, when you create these scenarios, you're going to find often that your kids will struggle at every single point. And some of the things you're just going to have to let go, and other things you're going to say, this is the thing that I have to teach now. Okay? And there's some strategies that we've used, but again, typically you teach the locate and communicate first. And then when kids start to give you irrelevant information that they located, now you teach evaluating relevancy. And then when they start to give you bogus or multiple perspectives that they don't appreciate the multiplicity of it, then you start looking at author source. And along the way you build in synthesis, because in the beginning I want you to locate one website and communicate it. Now I want you to locate 2. Now I want you to locate 4 and synthesize the ideas that are across all those. Find 2 things at the 4 websites that are saying that are the same. Find 2 that are different. Now I'm going to point you to 2 websites that are completely different. And you have to evaluate and synthesize and communicate. Now I'm going to point you to 5 websites that are completely different. And I'll show you an example. Do you see how the complexity keeps going? You can do that, and we've done that, and we're starting to explore with 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. You can do that in 2nd and 3rd grade. It's you, the experts in that, you know how to scale it down a little bit, and that's what we do in More PD, and you scale it up. But you can do that level of complexity and work through that at any grade level. Okay, so the big lesson here is not only now do we have to teach kids to think about what's in the search results, we actually have to get them to think about what's missing if they're trying to understand a comprehensive understanding of whatever the topic is. And maybe they actually have to conduct a different kind of search to get the alternative position rather than just what comes up first. And as soon as, again, as you start to deal with social or political kinds of issues, and you deal with the algorithms of Google, what's most popular is going to come up first. And what's most popular is definitely not always what's most diverse and appreciative of multiple perspectives. I'm just going to go through this, and I had planned on going through this really quickly. So in addition to evaluating the relevancy of search engine results, we also have to teach kids how to actually move through and navigate an informational website. The same way that we might give them a book talk about how you actually move through a textbook and all the pieces, we have to teach kids how to skim and scan the important things, whether it's the icons that have that used to be on the left-hand side, that were all words and menu items. Okay, now they've moved to the right side. They're starting to move into pictures. Whether it's looking at the menu bars and anticipating, how big is this website? How many different places is it going? Okay? Whether it's considering the sources and the authors, whether it's actually mousing over these dynamic images that are down on the bottom with number 3 here, because there's new menus that come up. So it's this whole concept of when you hand a kid a book, whether it's a pamphlet or it's an encyclopedia, they have a handle on how big this is. When they get to a website, whether it's the home page or a page in the middle, they have no clue. Is it a 2-page website that's very limited, or is it a 50,000 link goes on portal site that links to different perspectives? That becomes important because as I click through the site, am I actually clicking through the site of one person's perspective, or is every time I click, it's somebody different perspective on a different whole website? Okay? And so we also have lessons that we've talked about in terms of, again, it's all about modeling. But you also have to realize that we as teachers and each one of us might not know all the answers. And sometimes it means asking the kids to model. And one of the classroom kind of management systems that we've taken a lot of advantage of, we used to use Apple Remote Desktop. So in a one-to-one classroom, all kids had their own computer. We might have 25 or 30 kids. Okay? Sometimes we would have 2 kids use a computer, not because we didn't have enough, but because there were certain reasons. So other times we might have one-to-one. We would dump them into these scenarios, knowing probably that they would struggle. And what would happen is, when they struggled, we would go to a group that looked like they knew what they were doing. And we would pull up on our projector, computer number 7. And we say, what's your name? Ashley. We would say, Ashley, tell us what you're doing and why it's working. You get to become the teacher. And again, your kids are listening. Now, you have to maybe change this for elementary school, but I'm used to dealing with adolescents, and adolescents don't want to listen to me. They listen to their peers if they know what they're doing. And so Ashley says, well, I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And as she moves around, okay, it projects it for the whole class. If I wanted to, with some of the new smartboard things, I could record that. I could record her think aloud of how I do this. And that could become part of a database of strategic uses of navigating websites or critically evaluating or whatever. Now, I also then keep going around, and we look at this group over here, and Mike is really struggling. So we flip the computer to computer number 23, and I say, Mike, tell us what's happening. Okay? And you walk us through what's not working. And then I say, can anybody help Mike? And again, the kids start becoming experts. And so then we say, this person knows a lot about X. And we have a chart. And we say, we develop some classroom experts in our room. And so the whole point is to try to relinquish some of the responsibility, teach kids how to collaborate, teach kids how to take advantage of their own strengths, because that's when the power of the internet and technology is really not going to make a difference. It's not going to happen if I'm going to close it all in myself and hold it and keep everybody safe. It just won't happen. And so this idea of using students to provide think aloud models of what's working and what's not working is really, really useful. I've also done the same thing, moved from a class to a small group, guided reading group. Whether we're each reading the same website, or I have 5 little second graders and they're each reading a different website. Tell us one thing you learned. Who's the author of your website? They turn their iPad around, well, this is, so you practice all those little mini lessons that you taught them, and it becomes embedded into your guided reading lesson, or your literature circle, or whatever you want to call it. And so along the way, you get the idea that by introducing students to these scenarios, these tasks, and giving them an opportunity to practice and succeed and practice and fail, hearing your think alouds, we've now linked to opportunities, if we're going to ask them to generate appropriate search terms, okay, conduct short research to answer a question. That's the standard number 7. Gather evidence using search terms effectively. Those are writing standards in the Common Core. Locate the best website from a set of search engine results on the first click. Assess if the evidence is relevant. So you can start to see how it may not be exactly what the Common Core is measuring. We don't really know yet. But it certainly can't hurt, is what we're saying right now. And along the way, you build online reading skills. You build some confidence, especially at the younger grades, so then when they get to middle school and high school, it's not such a challenge for us to try and figure out how to teach all this stuff at the same time while still covering our content. Okay. We're going to move on a little bit to critical evaluation. This is an example of, and I'll have the 3 levels. I was talking about the NAEP 3 levels of comprehension. So you probably can't read all of that, but I was working with the State Department a number of years ago, and we were trying to develop questions that would assess students' comprehension of websites at that point. Okay? And so this site is about California's Velcro crop under challenge. Okay? They were losing a lot of water and they were wasting water, and so as a result, the Velcro crop was not being plentiful, and they were having some problems because they didn't have any more Velcro, and so they were talking about the implications of that. And so the teachers came up with questions about, let's say, what's a comprehension question that would assess their initial understanding? What 3 issues threaten this crop? Could probably find that. Okay? I could develop questions. Again, this is a time when teachers were trying to develop those valid comprehension questions that are going to reflect what's on standardized tests. I could ask them, given the author's recommendations, how might he vote on a decision to ration water supplies in years when there's a water shortage? They could write a whole essay on it. I could even work in some math and developing an interpretation, because this website has a bar graph. In the bar graph, in which year was there the greatest decline of acreage? Students could get 100% on those 3 questions. Does anybody have any problem? Which question did the standardized test not ask? Is this even true? This baloney that you're reading, that you can interpret and write an essay and look at bar graphs? So for the person who asked before, is this valid? You could argue from a reading comprehension perspective, yes, the offline measures are valid in measuring paragraph comprehension, but they're not valid in measuring whether or not the information is really true in a way that's necessary now that we're online. So pieces of both of those assessments have to be built into what we measure. That's kind of, and we're not doing that right now. We're not asking kids, we're not mixing up bogus and not bogus websites, and we're certainly not including them on any kind of standardized tests where we might have actually information that's not true. And we have to actually ask students to critically evaluate that information. The trickiest part from an assessment perspective of what's holding people back what do you really need in order to determine if the information at a website or on a page is really true? Where do you have to go? Can you stay on that website? You have to go somewhere else, which introduces multiple sources into assessment, which costs money, which means now I have to pick which multiple assessments. Well, the beauty of the internet in a valid kind of world is every kid's going to go someplace different in a way that works for them. And then you've got to deal with, well, are they reliable or unreliable sites that they go to? It's really hard for assessment to capture that, okay? So from a cost-effective kind of a way, it just doesn't work. But what we're arguing is, you know what, I don't care if it's cost-effective and whether we can teach it in a standardized kind of way. We need to teach it and assess it in our classroom so that we understand when kids are starting to get it and measure progress. Because right now we don't know how to, well, we do know how to measure it, but not a lot of people are using it. And so even if we were to waste the time or take the time to teach it, we'd have no way of understanding if our students are actually getting it unless we have some assessment. So that's really the argument that I told myself when I got into this whole assessment thing was coming from a special ed background, I want to know what to teach. And the only way I can know what to teach is I have to measure it in a performance-based kind of way. And so that's really where we're headed. Okay. So just some quick stories. Students know you can't trust everything on the internet. They will tell you on interview after interview because we conducted a study about it. Okay? We did not create this website, the Northwest Pacific Tree Octopus, or the other way around. It was up there on the internet. What we did do is we did a study with, I want to say 150 students who were the most skilled in our research project from both Connecticut and South Carolina, defined by their teachers as most skilled reading the internet. Okay? We've sent them to this website, and we sat down with them, and we said, so what do you think about this website? Well, first of all, what do you think about octopuses? What do they? Well, they need water. They can't live out of the water. Okay? These are smart kids, by the way. We had the whole range of offline performance in standardized tests. And so, well, let's read about this Pacific tree octopus that hangs out with Sasquatch, that eats all these interesting things, and lives in trees. And then tell us, do you think this information is very reliable, somewhat reliable, or not at all reliable, and why? And now actually I think it was 60. The 60 students. Of the 60, 56 said somewhat or very reliable. The 4 that didn't, ironically, had just participated in a lesson with this website. So we're kind of talking about 100% of what we define as teachers as the best online readers are totally duped. Now, what makes me even more nervous is when we ask them, if we told you that part of this information might not be valid or real, could you use the internet to prove which pieces are not true? Some students right off the bat said, there's a picture of it right there, duh. You know, there's really big paragraphs. There's like 10 paragraphs of information. Of course it's true. There's really big words. There's videos. Okay? We even had some students, when they went to search, guess what they put in their search box? Northwest Pacific tree octopus. And lo and behold, up came all of the other sites. People duplicate things, people replicate, people change, people, okay? So we had students finding the website that you can purchase t-shirts and buttons and fundraise, okay? Now the irony is this website was kind of created as a representation of kind of like the school joke now about how quickly students can be tricked, and let's buy some teachers to remind students that they shouldn't be tricked. But now students are finding this site, not understanding the context, not looking at even the About Us page, to realize this is 1 site, 2 sites, 3 sites. My teacher said I need 3 sites to say the same thing and then it's good. We can't use that standard anymore because this is what happens, okay? It happens the same way in elementary school. We've done similar, not studies, but classroom kinds of experiences. Free forever, Dog Island, okay? Your dog can go here, no people, they can live forever and be really happy. Interestingly, this comes, if you really do some searching and some research, this is actually a political commentary from a gentleman in Asia for a number of different reasons. So again, the way that things are interpreted, similar kinds of, if you're looking for a website to practice, to dupe kids and then give them practice, All About Explorers, A to Z, is specifically designed for teachers to give kids practice. But in the beginning, it's designed as real real explorers. And so even if kids were actually able to look at the About page, they would realize that the information is bogus. But what they do instead is they go create their Explorer reports with all the information, and then the teacher backs up and says, hi, caught you, and then here's a series of lessons to teach you more. I won't go into the details of this. You have the slides about this, but this is more empirical work from kids from my dissertation, 127th graders. Again, when I asked them questions about, they had to type in the answers, evaluating the accuracy of information. So they would find some information, and I would say, well, how do you know that's accurate? Well, the website, I think, is always right. It had plenty of pictures. I checked it out with Ask Jeeves. Why would they lie? 54% of the students in my study either had that kind of an answer or couldn't even find the website to talk about whether or not it was accurate. As you go up the rubric scores, you've got some implicit trust, but really no verifying off the website. And only two of the 120 students actually checked the website with a second reliable source. Now you have to be careful. Kids aren't stupid, they know. And so when they tell me in words, I checked the website with a second source, but they forgot, we told them, that they were being videoed. And so you'd have kids that say, oh, I know I'm supposed to go check a source, so I'm going to type that in, but they didn't go anywhere. So if you ask kids, they'll tell you they know what they're supposed to do. When we ask them why they don't do it, they don't know how. They know the declarative, they don't know the procedural, and they don't know the conditional. So it's back to that strategy chart again. We tell them it's important. They don't have a clue why, and they don't know what to do next. Similar kinds of results for reliability. It's really detailed. It has like 10 paragraphs. It must be true. Very, very seldom are kids actually looking at the source and not the information itself, which led us to developing, well, these were developed before, but we actually started teaching kids these very explicit definitions. And this is the point where you have to kind of think as whatever grade you teach and make these higher or lower to make it make sense to you. The biggest point that I want to make is critical evaluation has multiple facets. It's not as simple as telling kids, make sure your sites are reliable. First off, many kids think that means readable, really, through interviews, okay? If they know it's reliable, they don't know how to do it. And it's basically when we go back and talk to teachers, well, it means it's real. Well, what does that mean? How do you do that? I don't know. And so we're talking about, is it relevant? It could be completely bogus. How many people watch Saturday Night Live? All the spoofs. We watch Saturday Night Live because it's stupid and it's funny and it makes us laugh. It's not all true. So if we go on a website and find a bogus tree octopus site, that's really funny and that serves our needs, if we know that that's our needs. Okay? But if our needs are to do research and we find the tree octopus site, it's not all that relevant for our needs. So the purpose defines relevance. We cannot have a website that's good or bad specifically. Accuracy looks at the level of accuracy of the information. The only way we can look at that is to verify it with information on other websites. It has to be people who are different than the people who said what they said on one website. Okay? Because of course, the same Sally Smith is going to say the same thing in multiple places. The reliability of information doesn't necessarily look at the information itself. The reliability looks at the reliability of the person who created it. The source, is that person an expert? Is he consistently saying the same thing in a way that matches what other people are saying in a way that's valid? So the reliability looks at the author. The accuracy looks at the quality of the information. Both of those are important steps that rarely kids take and rarely do we teach. The idea of bias, we used to use the word bias. We don't anymore. Because what happens is, It suggests that bias is bad, and their goal is to find something that's not biased. Who can find something on the internet that's not biased? It's impossible, and that gets back to just regular critical literacy. Everything has a slant and a purpose, even if it says both sides or 10 sides, okay? And so by introducing the word perspective, we start to give kids an understanding of, you know what, my opinion is mine. It's not bad or good. Now, it could harm other people, could make people feel bad, but it's just an idea. Other people have other ways of thinking about it. That becomes really important when we start to deal globally with people from different political backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. What's right in our country or in our community isn't necessarily right in another, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong, bad. And so the idea of perspective helps students to understand this continuum and the shades of gray, dare I say that term, that has to do with information beyond just this is bogus and this is not. The only time we use commercial bias, at least from our perspective in schools, because typically commercial bias suggests that they're pushing an issue and they're kind of persuading you in a way that might not be as educational, is we still tend to use that. You could argue, you know, commercial bias. You could have good commercialism. We try to teach kids in school actually how to use things like Amazon.com and how to purchase things because they're going to do it at home. So there's some slides here, and you have a lot of the slides, but this just introduces you to the idea that even reliable sources like MSNBC and Newsweek, who put out this global IQ quiz, were then later told, you know what, you have inaccuracies. You made a mistake. You are a reliable source, but even reliable sources make mistakes, especially now with journalism and people wanting information like that. People will say 52 people died, then 100 people died, then I'm sorry, it's only 10. Okay? It's the reality that we live in, and so we need to teach kids about that and understand that even reliable sources can make mistakes and be inaccurate. So it's not enough to just say, oh yeah, Newsweek wrote this. Oh yeah, this is Discovery School. Look at the accuracy of the information. And so we walk you through in some of the activities that we do a number of different fact-checking kinds of ways to look for what is the author saying? What is the author claiming? And one of the things that has helped us introduce perspective and bias and critical evaluation to students is we don't talk about facts anymore. Everything is a claim. Because when you ask, what are the facts that the author is telling you? And then you tell middle school kids, well, you want them to question the facts. That's just really hard. But if we frame everything, well, what is this author claiming about the octopus? What is this author claiming about World War II? The claim adds just enough doubt that students are willing to take the risk to say, you know what, maybe the author is slanted, or maybe the author is downright wrong or inappropriate or whatever. And so we do activities where we create scenarios, again, where we give them 3 what sound like bogus websites. One of them is actually true. You're doing a report on a strange animal. We send you to one about the Loch Ness Monster. We send you one about the elephant who paints. And we send you to one about the armed and dangerous dolphins who are shooting guns. Or one of them is true. So what we do is we walk kids through this scenario, figure it out. Well, what do? Got my handy-dandy critical evaluation lesson. Or kids know, great, then we know, and we share. Okay? And then I get a handle on it. So in the beginning, the scenarios become these performance-based assessments of what do my kids know? It's like a pretest. They fail, it's okay, they're going to. But by failing, you watch what they don't know and you get an understanding of what they do know, and then you shape your lesson around that. I won't tell you the answer, but you can learn if you look on the website that I gave you at the beginning. We also try to model, again, when we talk about reliability, we look at the author. What's the author's name? What organization is he or she connected to? Is the author an expert on this subject, and how do you know? Because he said so? Or because other people are saying that he is or not? How does the author's level of knowledge compare with other people who do work in this area? Okay, so here's an example of Cells Alive. If you work in middle school in a science kind of environment, okay, this is an amazing website, has all kinds of interactive things. I'm not suggesting it's bad or good. It seems to be pretty accurate to me. Although when we look on the About Us page, this is what we know about the author, Jim Sullivan. He may or may not be an expert, but we don't know enough. Now, it's not that we just say all the information is bogus, but we look at the claims about mitosis, and we look at what other people are saying about mitosis, and if it looks valid and it's helpful, great. But we need to start to consider both the information and the author. These are ideas also that come up, especially at elementary school, but also middle secondary school. When we tell kids, we give them homework and we say, make sure you tell us who the author is. Okay, this is a website about the Underground Railroad, but the red things are the different authors. Who wrote this? Well, I don't know. There's 4 different people. Okay? Did somebody write it? Did somebody sponsor it? Did a team? We don't know. And so it's not as easy as just saying, make sure you find the author. Here's another example. Who is this author? Okay, if I go to the page, this is just a website for 3rd and 4th graders about healthy foods and healthy choices. That's it for information I get about the author from the page. So it's a challenge. It's not as easy as just telling kids to find the name, and that's going to help them know about the author. This is just a quick example, not bad or good. It is. Take a look. This is a website that was created about biographies for kids. If you were to try and pick up any kind of slant that might be on this page, that might influence the way information is represented on the page about famous leaders for young readers. It's not bad or good, it is. What are some of the things you see? Okay, so we've got Christian sites, we've got homeschool, we've got Garden of Braves. Now you have to have enough background knowledge to think about, well, which famous leaders might be on this page and which famous leaders might not because of the group that put together that page. So it's not that it's bogus, it's just, again, it's what's here, what's missing. Why is it missing? And how do I go find what's missing somewhere else? Those are really hard concepts for elementary school. I'm not suggesting you go there, although you can certainly talk about it as you visit places. But when we get to middle school and high school, that becomes imperative in order to really get kids to think about information and multiple perspectives in a way. They're going to be a voter. They're going to have to figure out where they sit on that continuum. And it's not just, here's all the people that are running for president, and I have to either agree with this person or this person or this person. First of all, you got to figure out where those presidents sit on some continuum of ideas, and then where do you want to sit? And it might not be any of those. And then who sits closest to you and why? And if you pick this person, what are the implications and what do you lose? That's really important life skill stuff. I don't care if it's on any measure of reading comprehension offline or online, but somehow we've got to figure out a way to teach that and let kids know that that's important. Okay, and if we do that, we get into the opportunity to practice, find what kids know, teach what they don't know in a way that encourages them to cite implicit and explicit textual evidence and support, determine the central idea or the claim and be able to summarize it, distinguish fact from reasoned judgment and speculation, and comprehend across complex texts. So, I know that I'm out of time. I had one more little piece, and I'll just show you some screenshots, and the website that I sent you to bring you to that. But this is the story of how we even started to learn about critically evaluating multiple perspectives. Again, it started as an assessment. This was the Iditarod, the dog racing thing that happens at middle school always study. They always go to the official Iditarod page, okay, and you get stuff like this, which is fine. But does anybody think they know about somebody who might not agree with the dog musher's perspective of the Iditarod dog races? So we all know even the organization. Okay, so anticipating that, we now know when we come across this page and see a very different representation of the same event, how could that be? And then we gave them a Scholastic website that actually had ideas represented from both sides and labels attaching them very explicitly to certain organizations. So we thought it was kind of easy. But we asked students, okay, can you figure out which website you think has the strongest opinions? I don't know. Can you find a quote that represents that opinion? Nope. Okay? So the idea of detecting fact versus opinion and figuring out where it comes from, actually considering what the author is saying and how that's connected to what organization they represent. I don't know, who cares? Why does it matter? Was the kinds of questions, and then determining author's purpose. Are they trying to sell you something? Are they trying to persuade you? Are they trying to inform you? Are they trying to make you laugh? Maybe they're doing a mixture, okay? And one of the things, so kids did so miserably, we thought, okay, we're just going to use this as a scenario now, and you do it. Figure it out, and when you don't, then we're going to teach you little pieces. And what started to happen was, as we went to new sites and we asked kids, what's the purpose? Kids would say, well, they're not really trying to sell you something because there's no money here, but they're trying to sell you ideas. Oh, that's really crucial. What ideas are they selling you? How are they selling it? Any middle school and high school that doesn't cover persuasive writing, I mean, that's what they're doing, okay? What better way to kind of kill two birds with one stone, if you will, and deal with all the complexities of online reading comprehension in a practice-safe, risk-taking kind of environment that we're all trying to figure out together, that can also tap into Common Core expectations and perhaps offline reading kinds of strategies. That's something I think that we should try to do. And I'll just show you this to give you an idea. When I talked about multiple perspectives, for upper middle school, high school, and I have a whole article about this if you're interested. This was when, how do different authors portray the Japanese internment camp experience to readers? So I created a whole kind of webspiration and linked them to 5 very, very different perspectives, even different historically in time, in terms of what we thought was accurate in 1942, in terms of then the public apology that came out. So you mean even whole countries can be inaccurate in their information for 30 or 40 years? Yeah. And so the idea of just looking at the date as, oh, that's recent or that's not recent as a measure of reliability is just kind of silly. And so we break students into groups. They do a lot of work within the text to look at the sources. And then we line them up across a continuum and we talk about across perspectives. And then the last thing, where do you sit on this idea and why does that matter? And this was just an example of some of the inspiration kind of products of within kinds of things. And I'll just mention the idea, if you're looking to just grapple with some of these issues, 2 websites to keep in mind are procon.org that send you to prepared at least 2 sides of the story that are very, very research-based from both sides that encourage kids to deal with some heavy-duty issues, but if you're ready for that. And then there's also something called the Glean Comparison Search. If you want to actually search for differences, you pick the term smoking marijuana, for example. You can either pick the one side and the other side, or you can type in your own. And then every time that you type those new words, a new set of search results come out on both sides. So there's your text right there, okay? And I think, obviously, we're talking about complex stuff now, but you can see by doing all those things, we're tapping into those major Common Core strategies. And this gives you an idea of the complexity when we say to kids, now make sure your information sources are reliable and make sure it's done by tomorrow and you have at least 5 relevant sites. These are all the things that we're asking kids to do. Every single one of those could be a challenge point for kids. We've got to figure out a way how to address that. And so, just to kind of sum up, again, hopefully you have a little idea of what is this idea that we're talking about online reading comprehension from a new literacies perspective, and at least some of the challenges, how we address that. Again, I think you might be able to talk about that a little bit this afternoon with some of the other talks that you'll have, but certainly there's a website for you to think about things, and I've got all kinds of papers and other things if you're interested. So, big thing is the internet, I believe, does require new, more complex, additional reading strategies that aren't sufficiently covered from how we currently assess and probably teach them. And I think we really should be paying attention and figuring out a way how to engage kids and make these things more relevant in our classroom. And I think that's it. And I'm sorry I went a little bit over time. Thank you.
We just have a few minutes. Do we have any other additional questions?
When you were working with the middle schoolers, teaching them for your project and things, did you teach it through the language arts or through the science and social studies? Because I think sometimes they learn it in language arts, then they have to do a research in science and they don't do it, or did they work together?
It's a good point. In that study, we were working in language arts classrooms, but what we noticed was that it didn't transfer over to the science and the history. And so what we're now working on with some high school teachers is we're actually working with the science and the history teachers and the library media specialist, and sometimes a language arts person, where they kind of work collaboratively. Any other questions?
I had heard a couple years ago that the upcoming park assessment, there's going to be some components of this as low as third grade where they will have to have an inquiry question online and need to be assessed on that. Can you address that, or do you know anything about that?
Yes, it might be old news. This was about 8 months ago, so I don't know if they've still decided to do it because it was a little controversial. But as far as I know, that kind of performance-based assessment, at least from a parks perspective, was going to happen orally in class with a rubric score that the teacher would provide. And basically it would be an ongoing, it might be a 8-hour project that might happen over 3 or 4 days that would involve students working in partners, generating a question related to a task, using print and digital resources, working collaboratively, building on ideas, and then pulling the information together, either in print or digital, and sharing it with their class. And so somehow magically, they were going to come up with a rubric that teachers locally were required to score and do that. That's where the oral language and the speaking and listening pieces were going to come in. And that's why I mentioned those comprehension and collaboration strands of speaking and listening. Don't overlook them, because they're very much connected to reading and writing. And from what I hear, they're very much going to be assessed in some way. I don't know if that's still the most recent representation of that, but that's at least what it was about 6 months ago. I think y'all are ready for lunch. I'm going to go ahead and say thank you very much. I don't have the links up there, but if you have... If you have questions, I know I can send Mike. I have and I actually think I put it on the very first website, very first page. If you're looking more for the teaching stuff, there's that website. And if you're looking for more papers and different kinds of things and a whole white paper on Common Core standards kind of stuff, you can visit that site. Thank you very much, and good luck with the rest of your day and when you head back out to classrooms. Thanks.